Oberyn Martell circled Gregor Clegane with quiet menace, the crimson sun of Dorne blazing upon his gilded armor. Dust swirled around the fighting pit, and the crowd pressed in closer, hearts pounding with the fervor of combat. Prince Oberyn's eyes danced with a hidden fire, alive with the promise of vengeance. He held his spear low, the tip aimed at the mountain's chest, and the slightest curve of his lips revealed his confidence. The man he faced was a lumbering brute of monstrous proportions, renowned for savagery, and yet the Red Viper displayed none of the hesitation that often afflicted lesser warriors. His steps were light and sure, each movement coiled with the deadly potential of a snake preparing to strike. Across the arena, the crowd roared for blood. Loyalists to House Lannister clamored for victory, while visitors and nobles from across the Seven Kingdoms watched the spectacle as if enthralled by a play whose final act they already anticipated. Many expected Oberyn Martell to die that day, for Gregor Clegane was no ordinary adversary. He was the beast whose savage reputation matched his height. Lord Tywin Lannister's gaze flicked from his champion to Oberyn. The older man's face betrayed no emotion. Beside him, Cersei Lannister gripped the arms of her chair, a mixture of delight and dread contorting her features. Tyrion Lannister, standing trial by combat for his life, watched with a swelling sense of hope. Oberyn Martell was his champion, and only Oberyn's victory would spare Tyrion's neck from the executioner's sword. The duel began anew. Oberyn leaped forward, his spear dancing in his hands like a living thing. Gregor Clegane swung his colossal sword in a wide arc, the edge slicing the air in a lethal sweep, but the Prince of Dorne anticipated it. He darted aside with lethal grace, letting the blade pass mere inches away. The crowd gasped, and dust erupted at the mountain's feet as the force of his swing gouged the ground. Sand sprayed Oberyn's boots, but he remained untouched. "You raped her. You murdered her. You killed her children," Oberyn snarled, each word barbed with venom as he repeated the accusation that had driven him since the death of his beloved sister, Elia Martell. The fury fueling him was like a flame roaring from the bowels of his soul. Yet his voice, while laced with hatred, carried a steady confidence that served him well. He wanted Gregor Clegane to remember what he had done. He wanted the mountain to feel the agony he had unleashed upon House Martell and upon Elia's memory. Gregor growled something unintelligible, half in rage and half in pain, for the spear's sharp edge had already nicked his flesh in several places. The crowd saw spattered blood on his plate, and Oberyn's advantage seemed ever more likely. The Red Viper spun once more, unleashing a deft strike that pierced the mountain's thigh through a chink in the armor. The giant let out a savage cry but pressed forward, swinging relentlessly with the fury of a maddened bull. Steel crashed against stone, and Oberyn's precision strikes kept him just outside the reach of the mountain's monstrous blows. Even as he fought, Oberyn's mind raced. He could not afford a single mistake. One misjudgment, one moment of laxity, and the mountain's blade would tear him in half. The Red Viper feinted to Gregor's right, drove his spear into the gap in the man's gorget, then pulled away, leaving behind a gruesome flow of fresh blood. He retreated several paces, his breathing accelerating but still controlled, eyes narrowed to slits. He felt the heartbeat in his ears, the thunderous pulse of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He swore he could hear his sister's voice urging him not to lose focus. He circled to the left, testing the mountain's reaction. Gregor lunged, sword raised high in an overhead blow that would have split Oberyn's skull like a melon. Yet Oberyn deftly rolled sideways, came up behind the giant, and rammed his spear into the back of Gregor's knee. The beast bellowed, tottering for a moment, but still refused to fall. Oberyn looked to the stands, to Tywin Lannister and then to Tyrion, locking eyes with both. This was a moment of reckoning for House Martell, a day that would echo across the realm for decades to come. "Who gave you the order?" Oberyn barked, maintaining enough distance to see how Gregor would react. The man's mask-like helm was dented, blood leaking from multiple wounds, but his rage remained a terrible force. "Who gave you the order to kill Elia Martell and her children?" Oberyn demanded, voice ringing across the stands. He wanted a confession, an admission of guilt not just from the Mountain but from Tywin Lannister himself. He would not settle merely for the Mountain's life. He wanted justice for Dorne. Gregor's gargantuan chest heaved. With a guttural grunt, he lunged once more, swinging downward. Oberyn leaned out of reach, pivoting on one foot, and jammed the butt of his spear into the ground for leverage. He delivered a brutal thrust into the Mountain's chest. The tip punctured the armor with a shriek of metal. Blood spurted forth, drenching the arena sand. Gregor sagged to one knee, trying to keep his massive sword raised. The crowd was on its feet, torn between horror and fascination, uncertain if the Mountain could possibly recover from these wounds. Oberyn snatched up a short sword discarded by a fallen combatant in a previous match. He advanced, glancing at the spear stuck in Gregor's chest, then at the Mountain's helmet. The giant stared at him through the visor, eyes burning with pain and anger. Oberyn approached with careful deliberation, for Gregor was still a threat. The Red Viper's mind blazed with a single desire. He would make sure this monster could never harm another soul. Yet he needed words. He needed Gregor to speak. The entire realm must know the truth. "Say her name," Oberyn hissed, stepping around to face the Mountain. "Oberyn Martell, say her name." He hammered the side of Gregor's helmet with the pommel of his short sword, demanding acknowledgement. The Mountain, exhaling ragged breaths, gave no immediate answer. His huge sword wavered as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. Finally, a low rumble escaped him, a half-choked confession of sorts. Yet Oberyn heard no clarity, just vile curses and a guttural moan. The Red Viper stepped back and prepared one final strike. But Gregor Clegane, in one last savage burst, tore the spear free of his chest. Though it must have been agonizing, the wound was not as immediately fatal as one might expect. Oberyn saw the Mountain's arm tense. In that heartbeat, Oberyn recognized a terrible truth. The Mountain's last surge of strength could end it all. But Oberyn was faster. The Red Viper did not gloat. He did not stand close enough for Gregor's monstrous arms to close around him. Instead, Oberyn dove in low, slicing his short sword in a clean arc that found the gap in Gregor's armor under the arm. A burst of blood sprayed across the sand, and Gregor's sword arm went limp. The Titan of House Clegane pitched to the side, spewing blood through the rents in his armor. A hush blanketed the crowd. Oberyn Martell stood, heaving, short sword clenched in a crimson fist. Gregor Clegane lay motionless, except for the faint rise and fall of his massive chest. One of the officials hurried forward, uncertain whether the Mountain was dead. King Tommen sat pale-faced, his young frame trembling beside his mother, Cersei, who looked as though she might faint. Tyrion's eyes glistened with relief. He dared to believe that fate had changed. There would be no monstrous end to Oberyn that day. There would be no false justice claiming Tyrion's life. At last, Oberyn lifted his head. He locked eyes with Tywin Lannister, and something fierce flickered there. That moment, an instant of silent triumph, shattered every assumption. Oberyn Martell had done the impossible. He had bested Gregor Clegane. He was still breathing, albeit painfully, but more importantly, he was alive. House Martell had triumphed over the Lannisters' greatest beast. The crowd erupted in a thunderous cheer, though many cheered out of shock rather than loyalty. None could deny the skill and bravado it had taken to defeat a man like the Mountain. Tyrion Lannister's trial by combat had its verdict. Tyrion was innocent by the law of the gods. Though Oberyn's personal quest for Gregor's confession had not yielded the perfect clarity he desired, the Red Viper's triumph spoke for itself. Tywin Lannister's expression revealed little, but inside he seethed, for Oberyn's victory spelled an end to one of Tywin's most formidable tools. The day belonged to the Martells in more than one sense. Oberyn had proven that Dorne would not remain complacent under King's Landing's shadow. As the onlookers began to disperse, Oberyn took one ragged step forward, breathing heavily through clenched teeth. Blood trickled from a shallow wound on his side, but he would survive. He motioned to Tyrion. The two exchanged relieved smiles. Tyrion offered a formal bow, struggling to find words that could properly convey his gratitude. Not far off, Prince Oberyn Martell of Dorne, seated in a specially arranged space for the trial, watched with tears in his eyes. He had dreaded losing his younger brother, but fate had granted Oberyn triumph. Soldiers wearing the sun and spear sigil of House Martell rushed forward, prepared to escort the prince to safety now that the trial had concluded. Oberyn walked, still limping but unbroken, out of the pit. The hush of the king's landing crowd fell upon him like a tangible weight. Every eye seemed to follow him. Every hush seemed to wrap around his presence. He could sense their awe, and in that moment, Oberyn made a silent vow. His victory would not end here. If he could slay the mountain, what else might be possible? He was no longer content to let events unfold around him. He had drawn blood from the most feared man in the Seven Kingdoms. A single thought burned in his mind. The Lannisters would pay for what they had done to Elia, to Dorne, and to the realm. In the days that followed, the news spread like wildfire through King's Landing. The Red Viper had slain the mountain. Tyrion Lannister was declared innocent of King Joffrey's murder and freed. The city buzzed with rumor, speculation, and a certain hushed trepidation. Oberyn and his retinue resided temporarily in the Red Keep, where the halls echoed with suppressed tension. Each step Oberyn took through the corridors was accompanied by watchful guards, sidelong glances, and whispered gossip behind tapestries. Tywin Lannister did not publicly confront Oberyn Martell. Instead, the hand of the king maintained a veneer of civility. Yet Oberyn sensed the old lion's controlled wrath, coiling like a viper beneath the surface. The politicking that took place in the small council chambers took on a sharper edge. Oberyn, representing Dorne, found himself receiving a polite but cool reception from the Lannisters and their allies. Margaery Tyrell and her grandmother, Olenna, were more cordial, but there was no denying the tension that hovered in the air. The Prince of Dorne did not waste time with empty courtesy. He pressed for answers about the fate of Elaya's remains, about the direct role Tywin had played in her murder. Subtly, through half-promises and ominous remarks, Tywin tried to deflect blame onto Gregor alone, swearing no direct command had been given to harm Elia and her children. Oberyn's anger burned anew, but he kept his composure. A direct outburst would lead nowhere, and he knew that Tywin was a master manipulator. During this time, Oberyn also made a point of visiting Tyrion Lannister in private. The two men, who seemed an unlikely pair of friends, shared an appreciation for wit and clever conversation. Oberyn, for all his hatred of House Lannister's crimes, found Tyrion an exception, someone who had treated him with respect. Tyrion, in turn, voiced his gratitude, knowing that without Oberyn's victory, he would have perished. Over cups of sweet Dornish wine, they spoke of the future, of a realm fractured by war, of the ambitions swirling around the Iron Throne. Tyrion jokingly said that he owed Oberyn his life twice over now, once for championing him and once for ensuring that champion survived. Oberyn responded with a wry grin. He told Tyrion that, in the end, if the Lannisters persisted in their cruelty and deception, the sands of Dorne would shift and bury them. The cryptic comment made Tyrion uneasy, but he knew better than to press the matter. He respected Oberyn enough to recognize the sincerity in his words. Meanwhile, Oberyn's older brother, Oberyn Martell, was quick to see that Oberyn's victory had ignited a dangerous spark of ambition. Back in the manse Dorne occupied, he confronted his brother, cautioning him against rash actions. The desert sun was fierce, he said, but it could not burn the entire realm without consequences. Dorne reminded Oberyn of the delicate negotiations they had undertaken with the Iron Throne, the alliances and future marriages that might bring long-term peace. Oberyn listened, but his heart was set on a course of justice that could no longer be contained by slow politicking. Where Dorne sought to keep Dorne's power subtle, Oberyn dreamed of a bolder path, one that might see Dorne stand unbowed, unbent, unbroken against all who had harmed it. Late one night, as the moon hung low over King's Landing, Oberyn slipped from the Red Keep to rendezvous with a handful of trusted Dornish captains and swordsmen. A few satchels of gold exchanged hands. Quiet words were shared about mustering ships, rallying spears in Dorne, and forging a new future. Oberyn's will had grown more resolute since the mountain's death. If the crown would not deliver true justice, he would see to it himself. Amid the hush of midnight, a plan took shape, a plan that would require careful orchestration, stealth, and decisive strikes. The merchants and captains hurried away, leaving Oberyn alone in the flicker of a distant torch. He gazed out over the moonlit rooftops of the city, imagining the scorpion-like shape of the Red Keep from a distance. The seat of the Iron Throne was a fortress, but Oberyn knew fortresses could be overthrown if one possessed the right strategy, and if the realm itself was fractured enough to allow it. The first steps were subtle. Oberyn and his loyalists set about forging private alliances. They reached out to certain Stormlords who harbored resentments toward the Lannisters, to Riverlords still smarting under the devastation wrought by the War of the Five Kings, to Ironborn who might be open to distraction if gold were offered freely. Oberyn had always traveled widely, earning acquaintances in all corners of the realm. Those acquaintances soon became allies, some open, others covert. The Martell name, backed by the victory over the mountain, carried weight. It became a symbol of defiance, a beacon for those who saw the Lannisters as overreaching tyrants. Back in Dorne, the news of Oberyn's triumph spread like a burst of sunlight after a storm. The people remembered Elaya's fate, and their hearts beat fierce and proud at the thought of Oberyn avenging her and surviving. With Prince Doran's cautious blessings, though never explicitly confirmed, the armies of Dorne began to train more vigorously. Spearwives and knights, crossbowmen and cavalry, all readied themselves for the possibility that Oberyn's victory was but the start of something greater. The roads through the desert sands saw convoys of supplies, wagons of weapons, and lines of recruits drilling under the hot sun. While tensions simmered in King's Landing, Oberyn's presence began to shift the political dynamic of the small council. Mace Tyrell, always seeking to keep the favor of the Lannisters, looked upon Oberyn with guarded unease. Grand Maester Pycelle was polite but unhelpful, ever the toady to House Lannister. Varys, the Master of Whisperers, observed Oberyn closely. He offered mild hints of counsel, cryptic suggestions that perhaps the realm was best served by peace rather than further bloodshed. Littlefinger, cunning and opportunistic, made overtures of friendship toward Oberyn, but the Red Viper did not trust him. Peter Baelish's alliances seemed to shift with the winds. Oberyn would not be caught unawares by a man so adept at playing rival factions against one another. Behind closed doors, Oberyn leveraged the truth he had gleaned from Gregor's near confession. Whispers reached him of Maester Qyburn's suspicious treatments, of Gregor's battered but not quite dead body somewhere deep within the Red Keep's hidden chambers. The thought that Qyburn might be experimenting on the mountains remains disgusted Oberyn, but it also steeled his resolve. The Lannisters would surely try to cover their crimes yet again. They would do anything to hide the truth about Elaya's death and to maintain a grip on the throne. Oberyn prepared for the moment to strike. 2 months after the trial by combat, Oberyn quietly left King's Landing under the pretense of returning to Dorne. He rode forth in the early hours of dawn, accompanied by a modest retinue. The Lannisters, suspecting he might be leaving for good, allowed his departure without hindrance, relieved perhaps to be rid of his disruptive presence. Tyrion, uncertain what Oberyn's plans were, bid him a careful farewell, but Oberyn did not reveal his full purpose. Instead, he only told Tyrion that if the day came when House Martell rose in open rebellion, Tyrion would be wise to choose his side carefully. Word reached Tywin soon enough that Oberyn's knights and sellswords were gathering in force. Spies brought news of warships being armed in Sunspear, of alliances forming around the Stormlands and the Reach, and of the might of House Martell swelling in readiness for conflict. Tywin responded by sending ravens to potential supporters, recalling Lannister bannermen from the Westerlands, and re-establishing ties with the Freys in the Riverlands. Tensions soared across the realm. The memory of the War of the Five Kings still loomed large, but it appeared another uprising might ignite. Yet Oberyn Martell was more than just a vengeful warrior. He was a cunning strategist in his own right. Rather than rush headlong into battle, he spent time in Dorne planning. He convened a council of captains, Dornish lords, sellsword captains from Essos, and envoys from certain northern houses who bore grudges against the Lannisters for the Red Wedding. With his famous charm and unwavering determination, Oberyn persuaded them that the Lannisters were vulnerable. King Tommen was young, and while Cersei served as Queen Regent, her grip on power was tenuous. Tywin, though formidable, was aging, and cracks were appearing in the old lion's hold over the realm. The Iron Throne was not as secure as it seemed. During these councils, Oberyn explained that Dorne had never truly bowed to the Targaryens. They had their own way of life, their own fierce identity. If the Lannisters had dared to defile Oberyn Martell and her children and had gone unpunished, what guarantee did the rest of the realm have that the Lannisters would not trample upon them next? House Martell's cause was not merely about vengeance for Elia. It was about ensuring no one else would suffer a similar fate. The rallying cry became a reassertion of Dornish strength and independence, a call for justice that resonated with many who had grown weary of Lannister tyranny. Gradually, Oberyn's plan took shape. He knew a direct assault on King's Landing would be suicide. The city was still defended by the Gold Cloaks, loyal Lannister men-at-arms, and the Red Keep's formidable walls. Instead, Oberyn chose to sow chaos along the periphery. Dornish outriders moved along the Stormlands, forging alliances with minor lords discontented by the crown's taxes. Pirate fleets from the Stepstones were paid handsomely to harass shipping lanes to and from King's Landing. In the Reach, Oberyn courted younger sons of powerful houses with promises of glory and spoils. All the while, the re-armed Dornish fleets and armies waited for the perfect moment to strike. The tension in King's Landing reached a fever pitch. Cersei Lannister, by then bearing the regency for King Tommen, raged against the Dornish treachery. She demanded swift action, but Tywin cautioned restraint. He suspected Oberyn was attempting to lure the Lannisters into overextension. Eager not to repeat mistakes from earlier wars, Tywin began to methodically strengthen the city's defenses. He dispatched Kevan Lannister to gather troops from the Westerlands, while sending ravens to the Eyrie to coax the Vale into remaining neutral or, ideally, supportive. Yet the Vale, under the uncertain leadership of Petyr Baelish, offered no quick commitment. Months dragged on. Skirmishes broke out along the borders of the Reach and Stormlands. A Dornish raiding party overran a Lannister outpost near the headwaters of the Mander. The Outriders vanished into the desert with minimal losses. In the east, newly minted alliances with certain sellsword companies gave Oberyn additional manpower. Secret deals were struck at sea, ensuring that when the time came, Dorne's ships would blockade Blackwater Bay to cut off King's Landing from supplies. Meanwhile, Prince Doran watched with wary eyes. Though he had once insisted on a more measured approach, Oberyn's success at forging alliances and outmaneuvering the Lannisters politically reassured him. Perhaps it was time, he mused, for Dorne to assert itself more forcefully on the stage of the Seven Kingdoms. The memory of Elaya's murder still haunted him, fueling a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Still, Doran worried about the cost of open war. But Oberyn's unstoppable determination became a tidal wave, washing away any reluctance. Too many men, women, and children had been lost to the ambitions of House Lannister. Dorne would no longer stand idle. At last, the day arrived when Oberyn judged the time was right. Carefully orchestrated sabotage left a portion of King's Landing storehouses in flames one sweltering summer night. Gold Cloaks scrambled to contain the disaster, leaving parts of the city vulnerable. Before dawn, a Dornish fleet appeared off the coast, just beyond the horizon. As morning broke, small vessels carried groups of hand-picked Dornish soldiers and allied forces to hidden coves near the city. From there, they launched a swift, surprise assault on the outlying fortifications, aiming to secure vantage points along the bay. Simultaneously, Oberyn's land forces advanced through the Stormlands in a calculated push toward the capital. Lords who had allied with Oberyn opened their gates, letting Dornish soldiers pass unmolested. Mercenary companies, fresh from Essos, hammered Lannister outposts along the Rose Road. Rumors of a second wave of Dornish cavalry sweeping up from the south demoralized many smaller loyalist garrisons, leading them to surrender without a fight. Step by step, the net tightened around King's Landing. Inside the Red Keep, chaos reigned. Cersei seethed at the betrayal, blaming all and sundry for failing to predict Oberyn's cunning. Tywin, though outwardly calm, recognized that events had moved faster than expected. He called upon the city's defenders to man the walls, sent urgent pleas for reinforcements, and prepared King Tommen to remain safe within the fortress. Tyrion, witnessing this brewing storm, kept his own counsel. He remembered Oberyn's parting words and suspected the Red Viper's plan might just succeed if executed swiftly enough. But Tyrion also knew that a prolonged siege would ravage the city and bring untold suffering to common folk. As ever, the powerless masses would pay the highest price. On a gray, overcast morning, Oberyn led his main army to within sight of the city's southern walls. The Dornish banners rippled in the wind, golden suns pierced by spears on crimson fields. At his side rode several prominent lords of Dorne, their faces set in grim determination. Hundreds of knights, foot soldiers, and archers formed a vast host arrayed across the plains, ready to do battle. Further off, siege weapons constructed in secret were hauled into position. Trebuchets, scorpions, and rams, each prepared to breach the city walls. The murmured prayers of thousands of soldiers filled the air, mingling with the pounding of drums. Oberyn stared at the towering walls of King's Landing. He remembered wandering its streets in the past, tasting its pleasures and enduring its corruption. Now he approached those walls not as a visitor, but as a conqueror, determined to unseat the Lannister regime. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, recalling Alya's laughter, the gentleness in her eyes when she held her children. He clenched his jaw. All of it was for her, and for every life the Lannisters had shattered. A lone rider emerged from the gates under a white flag. It was a herald sent to parley. Oberyn, wishing to avoid unnecessary bloodshed if possible, rode forth to meet the man. Surrounded by a few trusted Dornish knights, he halted. The herald announced that Lord Tywin Lannister demanded the withdrawal of Dornish forces, under penalty of utter destruction. The Mountain's End, the herald declared, changed nothing of the crown's might. The boy king would never bow to Dornish threats. Oberyn listened, expression unmoved, then dismissed the herald without fanfare. He refused to negotiate with Tywin on those terms. The herald galloped back to the city gates, the defenders upon the ramparts cursing and jeering as the Dornish lines held firm. Thus began the siege of King's Landing. Dornish archers unleashed a volley of flaming arrows upon the outer walls, igniting pockets of flame along wooden structures. The city's defenders retaliated with their own arrow volleys, ballista bolts, and boiling oil. The clang of steel and the roar of catapults echoed across the battlefield. The wide moat in front of the city gates became a killing field, as spear-wielding Dornishmen attempted to cross with improvised bridges under a hail of projectiles. Siege engines rumbled forward, battered by flaming pots and scorpion bolts from the walls. Through it all, Oberyn moved with calm resolve, directing his captains, ensuring that the pressure on the walls remained relentless but measured. He would not squander his troops needlessly. Patience, he reminded them, patience and cunning would break the gates in time. Meanwhile, the Allied fleets patrolled Blackwater Bay, blockading any attempts to bring supplies into the city by sea. Starvation loomed as a weapon as fierce as any sword. Panic flared in the streets of King's Landing, where small folk realized their food stores were already perilously low. Cersei tried to seize every morsel for the Red Keep, intensifying the population's desperation. Whispers of betrayal grew among the gold cloaks, some of whom were rumored to consider opening the gates in exchange for mercy from House Martell. But Tywin's presence kept them in check. The old lion, though aged, retained a commanding authority. Days turned into weeks. The stench of death hung over the battlefield. Fallen soldiers littered the ground near the walls. Occasionally, envoys ventured out with new offers or threats. Tywin demanded that Dorne surrender or face the city's savage defense. Oberyn countered that if the city continued to resist, he would have no choice but to unleash the full fury of his siege engines. The memory of wildfire from the Battle of the Blackwater still haunted many defenders, But there were no rumors of the Mad King's hidden caches igniting this time. Rather, the city's greatest threat came from the relentless attrition inflicted by the Dornish blockade. On one starlit night, the Dornish launched a coordinated assault on the King's Gate. Engineers had erected a mighty trebuchet capable of hurling boulders that shattered the ramparts. Under cover of darkness, a swarm of seasoned Dornish spearmen rushed the defenders. Their distinctive spiked helmets and the golden sun symbols on their shields glimmered under torchlight as they poured over the rubble. The defenders fought back fiercely, but the weight of the Dornish momentum threatened to overwhelm them. Within the Red Keep, alarm bells rang out, and Tywin dispatched reinforcements. A savage melee ensued, blades clashing, men screaming, firelight dancing on steel. By the time dawn broke, parts of the outer wall near the King's Gate were on the verge of collapse. Retreating Lannister soldiers fell back behind secondary fortifications, leaving a battered but still impassable breach for the moment. Oberyn seized the small victory. He established a forward camp in the rubble, erecting barricades to hold what his forces had gained. Though the gate was not yet fully conquered, the defenders' morale had suffered a blow. As the siege continued, desertions from the Gold Cloaks increased. Some scaled the walls at night, escaping into the Dornish lines, desperate for a chance at life. They whispered of hunger ravaging the city, of Tywin's unstoppable rage, of Cersei's paranoid obsession with punishing any who whispered defeat. Innocent small folk were dragged before the Queen Regent and executed on charges of conspiracy. Tension ran so high that many believed King's Landing was a tinderbox waiting for a spark to set it aflame. In the midst of this turmoil, word spread that Gregor Clegane had died at last. Whatever twisted experiments Qyburn had attempted, they had not succeeded. The mountain's final demise became a grim footnote in a city drowning in fear. Oberyn took little pleasure in it. He had defeated the man once. The rest mattered little. His thoughts focused on the final confrontation with House Lannister. He wanted them to pay in blood, but even more, he wanted the entire realm to recognize Dorne's power. He wanted the Iron Throne to tremble before the sun and spear. Finally, after months of bitter conflict, the cumulative pressure of siege, blockade, and internal unrest threatened to topple the Lannisters' control. Tywin's pleas for reinforcements from the Westerlands had met with limited success. Too many lords feared leaving their own lands unprotected against potential raids by Oberyn's allies. The Tyrells weighed the wisdom of committing fully to the Lannisters. Margaery Tyrell, wed to King Tommen, found herself torn. She had no love for Oberyn Martell, but neither did she wish to see the realm burn. The Tyrells sent only a token force, cautious of risking their own armies while Dorne's might raged unchecked. So it came that one morning, under a sky thick with storm clouds, Oberyn ordered the final assault. This time, the main Dornish host converged on the Iron Gate and the King's Gate simultaneously, each backed by siege towers and a mass of infantry. The defenders, weary and hungry, mustered what strength they could. Tywin Lannister stood upon the ramparts in full armor, trying to stiffen the resolve of his men. Beside him, a gaunt-looking Cersei glared with hatred at the Dornish lines. King Tommen was nowhere to be seen. They kept him hidden away. The walls thundered with the impact of stones from catapults, and screams filled the air. Fire sprang up in places where pitch and oil had been deployed. The clash of steel resonated like a chorus of despair, echoing over the carnage below. Oberyn fought at the forefront of his troops, spear in hand, this time wearing a plumed helm shaped like a serpent's head. He led a surge up a siege tower, crossing a drawbridge onto the walls themselves. Lannister archers tried to pick him off, but Oberyn wove past their arrows. He impaled one guard, kicked another off the rampart, and slashed a third across the throat. The adrenaline of battle coursed through him like liquid fire. Around him, Dornish fighters carved a path of blood and destruction, determined to secure the wall walk. Seeing the breach widen, Tywin advanced with a group of loyal knights, his face rigid with cold fury. He confronted Oberyn in a stretch of rampart where the stones had crumbled under siege fire. Sparks flew as their blades met, Oberyn's spear glancing off Tywin's sword. Despite Tywin's age, the old lion moved with formidable skill and the discipline of a lifelong warrior. Oberyn pressed the attack, forcing Tywin to retreat step by step. The Red Viper's rapid strikes sought any gap in Tywin's defense, but Tywin was no fool. He fought with economy of motion, parrying and riposting, ensuring that Oberyn could not easily slip past his guard. "Surrender," Oberyn hissed between lunges. "Spare your grandson's life. Spare the city. Dorne will see you answer for what you've done." Tywin's mouth curled into a sneer. "You think the realm will suffer you on the Iron Throne, Martell? You know nothing of ruling. You're a vengeful viper, fixated on old wounds." Oberyn feinted, forcing Tywin off balance. Their blades locked, sparks dancing. "You gave the order," Oberyn snarled. "You killed my sister. You butchered her children. This realm deserves better than your cruelty." With a desperate twist, Tywin wrenched his sword arm free, nearly slashing Oberyn across the ribs. The blow caught part of Oberyn's armor, leaving a shallow gouge. Tywin stepped back, breathing heavily. "You think you're any different?" he spat, trying to goad Oberyn. "You've set this city aflame. Small folk starve. Look at the suffering you've caused." Oberyn's face contorted with anger, but he steadied himself. He recalled the stories of how Tywin had sacked King's Landing during Robert's rebellion, unleashing Gregor upon Elia and her children. The old lion was a hypocrite if ever there was one. Oberyn refused to let Tywin's words pierce his resolve. "If the city starves, it is because the Lannisters refuse to surrender," he retorted, voice shaking with barely contained rage. "We offered you a chance. You spat on it. Now this is the price that must be paid." Their blades met again. The clang of steel reverberated through the air. Around them, Dornish soldiers engaged Lannister knights, bodies strewn across the wall walk. Thick smoke billowed where fires raged. Thunder rumbled overhead, and fat raindrops began to fall, mingling with the blood on the stones. Oberyn pressed in close, hooking Tywin's sword arm with his spear. Using the leverage, he wrenched Tywin's sword wide, opening his defense. With a ferocious thrust, Oberyn drove his blade toward Tywin's chest. Tywin, in one final act of defiance, twisted aside, so the blade did not pierce his heart but bit deep into his shoulder. He staggered, dropping his sword, blood pouring from the wound. Grimacing in agony, the old lion locked eyes with Oberyn, seeing in them the reflection of his own mortality. Oberyn stared back, panting, thoughts of Elia at the forefront of his mind. He could end Tywin's life with a single blow. Dornish soldiers hurried around them, securing the wall, disarming or slaying the last pockets of resistance. Tyrion Lannister was not present to witness the final confrontation, but Oberyn imagined how the imp might have reacted to seeing his father brought low. King's Landing had fallen into chaos below, with citizens rioting, gold cloaks deserting, and fires spreading. A battered city, on the verge of collapse, stood at Oberyn's mercy. "Surrender," Oberyn repeated in a quieter tone, raising his voice to be heard above the tumult. "Call off your men. End this now. Order Cersei to yield the crown." Tywin's lips twisted in pain. "You'll show her no mercy," he said, voice hollow. "You'll do as you please with the throne." Oberyn's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps I will. Perhaps the realm deserves a new order. The Lannisters' time is done." Tywin let out a ragged breath, resignation flickering in his eyes. The weight of the day's defeat pressed upon him. "Very well," he whispered, "if it spares the city further destruction." A violent cough tore through his words, spraying blood. "Then let the city yield." Oberyn watched Tywin slump to his knees, blood dripping onto the wet stones. The Red Viper gestured for his men to seize the old lion. At Oberyn's command, a signal horn blew. From rampart to rampart, from gate to gate, the message spread. The defenders were to stand down. Anyone who fought on risked immediate death. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the remaining Lannisters and gold cloaks ceased their resistance. Swords clattered to the ground, men sank to their knees, and a hush fell over the walls. Lightning flickered in the stormy sky. Below, the city boiled with chaos. Fires burned in Flea Bottom. Looting ran rampant. The horrors of siege and battle rarely ended neatly. Oberyn cursed under his breath, knowing that with the city's defenses broken, anarchy reigned among the desperate population. He dispatched orders for his captains to restore order, to protect innocents where possible, and to restrain the more unruly segments of his allied forces. He did not crave a massacre. He wanted to rule a city that respected and feared him, not a city reduced to ash. Harsh measures would be required to quell the riots, but Oberyn promised himself he would not stoop to the Lannisters' level of cruelty. His brand of vengeance included forging a better future for those left alive. Soldiers dragged Tywin away to be treated for his wound, carefully kept alive for Oberyn's retribution. On the highest tower of the Red Keep, the Dornish banners replaced the royal banners of House Baratheon Lannister. A crimson sun with a golden spear fluttered in the storm wind, lit by the glow of fires below. Oberyn ascended the steps of the throne room, which was deserted save for a handful of Dornish knights, ensuring that no last Lannister loyalists lurked in ambush. The massive doors groaned as he pushed them open. Torchlight revealed the Iron Throne looming at the far end, an ugly silhouette of twisted swords. Oberyn paced across the marble floor. His boots clicked, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Rain lashed the windows, lightning illuminating the chamber in sporadic flashes. He approached the throne, hand tightening on the hilt of his weapon. This was the seat of power that had loomed over them all, that had sheltered the likes of Aerys Targaryen, Robert Baratheon, and the Lannisters. Oberyn Martell had died for the sake of Rhaegar Targaryen's misplaced ambitions, and the Lannisters had used that tragedy to install their own dynasty. Oberyn felt a surge of conflicting emotions: triumph, sorrow, fury, hope. He wondered if this monstrous chair fashioned from melted swords could ever truly serve justice. Oberyn Martell entered behind him, escorted by guards. The older prince's expression was heavy with worry but also faint relief. "It's done," Oberyn murmured, looking around at the ravaged throne room. "We've broken the Lannisters' power." Oberyn glanced over his shoulder at his brother, offering a small nod. He paced to the throne side. "But at what cost?" he asked softly, his tone marked by a sudden sadness. "Look at this city. It bleeds just as Elia bled. Is that justice? Or is it another cycle of madness?" Oberyn did not reply immediately. He moved forward, placing a hand on Oberyn's arm. "We will do better. We must. We've seized King's Landing not just to avenge Elia, but to ensure a realm where such horrors never happen again. Is that not worth the price?" Oberyn's gaze drifted to the twisted metal seat. Memories of Elia, his own children, and Dorne's future clouded his thoughts. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his helmet and let it fall to the floor. His face was streaked with grime, sweat, and a few cuts, yet his eyes still burned with the passion that had carried him this far. In the silence broken only by distant thunder, he placed a hand on the arm of the Iron Throne. The metal felt cold and unforgiving against his skin. A door slammed open at the far end of the throne room. A trio of Dornish guards dragged Cersei Lannister in, her golden hair wild, her gown torn and streaked with blood and ash. She struggled, spitting at them, her face contorted in a mask of fury. "You dare," she shrieked. "You think you'll just place yourself on that throne? It is my son's by right. You filthy Dornish snake." Oberyn turned slowly, releasing the arm of the throne. His face remained unreadable as he approached Cersei. She tried to claw at him, but the guards held her firm. The space between them crackled with hatred, a reflection of the unending enmity between Martell and Lannister. Oberyn remembered how she had gloated during his trial by combat, how she had cheered for Gregor to butcher him. Now she stood powerless before him. "You call me a snake," he said in a cold voice. "Yes, but the snake has sunk its fangs into the lion, and now the lion bleeds." Cersei spat. "You'll never rule. The people won't follow you. They'll resist. The other great houses will unite against you." Oberyn merely studied her. Despite everything, He felt a certain pity for this woman who had lost her eldest son to poison, watched her father gravely wounded, and now faced defeat. But pity would not wash away House Lannister's sins. "Your father surrendered," Oberyn said, eyes unwavering. "He'll stand trial. So will you. Your brother Jaime is away, and I doubt he'll ride to your rescue. You have no friends left here." Cersei's face twisted. "I'll see you burn," she hissed. "One way or another, I will see you burn." Doran, standing behind Oberyn, exchanged a glance with his brother, silently urging restraint. Oberyn exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath. "Take her to the dungeon," he ordered the guards. "We'll decide her fate in time." The guards hauled Cersei away. Her shrill curses echoed, fading down the corridor. Oberyn watched her go, then turned to Doran with a weary look. "The city must be stabilized. We can't allow chaos to rule." Doran nodded. "I'll see to it. We'll reorganize the gold cloaks under loyal captains. We'll distribute food from the Red Keep stores carefully." They shared a long moment of silence. The dawn was breaking through the shattered windows, the storm clouds drifting away to reveal pale sunlight. Smoke rose from various parts of the city, but with each passing hour, the worst of the fires were contained. Bells tolled a somber note for the dead and the defeated. Oberyn turned back to the Iron Throne. In that moment, he felt an odd mixture of revulsion and allure. This seat had brought so much pain to so many, yet it stood as the symbol of ultimate power in the Seven Kingdoms. Could he truly shape a better realm from its seat? He had the cunning, the alliances, the will. The question gnawed at him. Would he become as ruthless as the Lannisters if he took it upon himself to rule? He thought of Elia again, of all that had been lost. He whispered her name under his breath, an invocation and a lament. Then he seated himself upon the Iron Throne. The metal pricked him, drawing a bead of blood on his arm, an ancient tradition that many kings had experienced. He winced but did not flinch. He gazed across the throne room, imagining the weight of the realm upon his shoulders. In the quiet, among the shattered remains of a night of bloodshed, a new order was being born. He felt it in his bones, a shifting of fate. The Red Viper of Dorne had not only survived, he had conquered. Soldiers filed in, men from Dorne and others from across the realm who had joined Oberyn's cause. They knelt, still panting from battle, swords clattering to the floor in a show of fealty. Their expressions ranged from awe to uncertainty. Oberyn lifted a hand, granting them permission to stand. He spoke in a low, steady voice, projecting to every corner of the throne room. He declared that the city was under Dornish control, that House Lannister was defeated, and that justice would be served. He swore an end to the tyranny of those who preyed upon the innocent. He invited all who had grievances against the Lannisters to step forward, though he tempered his words with caution, urging calm. Among those who approached was a group of ragged small folk, trembling with a mixture of fear and hope. They begged for bread, claiming that they had neither eaten nor drunk clean water in days. Oberyn nodded to Doran, who dispatched men to fetch supplies. The sight of the new occupant on the Iron Throne doling out provisions to starving citizens was a surreal one. Word would spread quickly that the Red Viper, though fearsome, was not interested in punishing the common folk for the crimes of the highborn. It was a small gesture, yet it carried great significance. In the days that followed, the city slowly returned to a semblance of order. Dornish overseers patrolled the streets, working to quell looters and re-establish markets. Any gold cloaks who pledged loyalty to Oberyn were reinducted to keep the peace. Those who refused were imprisoned. Tywin Lannister lay in a secure chamber, recovering under the watchful eyes of Dornish guards and maesters loyal to Oberyn. Oberyn sent out ravens proclaiming the fall of kings landing to House Martell, inviting other noble houses to recognize Dornish authority. Some would resist, others would be pragmatic. The realm was vast and weary from years of strife, but Oberyn's bold triumph might prove too formidable to overthrow. Within the Red Keep, Tyrion Lannister appeared one day under heavy guard, seeking audience with Oberyn. Rumor had it Tyrion had tried to slip away from the city amid the chaos, but curiosity or duty drew him back. He stood before the throne, dwarfed by its size, a curious half-smile tugging at his lips. "Prince Oberyn," Tyrion said, inclining his head. "Or should I say, Your Grace now?" Oberyn regarded him steadily. "No formal coronation has been held. I haven't styled myself as king. Not yet." Tyrion pursed his lips. "I see. And what of my father and sister? Am I to be locked away as well?" Oberyn gestured for Tyrion to come closer. The guards bristled, but Oberyn held up a hand to reassure them. Tyrion approached. There was a flicker of tension in the air. They had once fought on the same side in that trial by combat, and it had saved Tyrion's life. Now, the dynamics had shifted drastically. "I remember the day you thanked me for championing you," Oberyn said quietly. "You know what I did was as much for my own reasons as for yours." Tyrion nodded, a touch of sadness in his eyes. "And now you've succeeded beyond anyone's expectations." His gaze lingered on the twisted swords of the throne. "My father always believed only fear and gold could rule. Is that how you intend to hold power?" Oberyn considered the question. "Fear has its uses," he admitted, voice grave. "But if I rule only through terror, I become no better than those I've overthrown." "And gold," Tyrion pressed. Oberyn offered a faint, humorless smile. "I have enough gold from Dorne's coffers and alliances to keep the city's needs met for a time. But eventually, I'll need the goodwill of the realm, or we'll slide into endless rebellion." Tyrion studied Oberyn's face, searching for some sign of deception. Finding none, he released a sigh. "I've no great love for my father, nor for my sister. But Tommen, he's just a boy. If you must do away with my family, I only ask that you spare him if you can." Oberyn's eyes flickered with sympathy. "I do not make war on children," he said firmly. "He will remain unthreatened, so long as no one tries to use him as a figurehead to incite further revolt." Tyrion bowed his head in relief. "Thank you." After a pause, he met Oberyn's gaze directly. "It's ironic, isn't it? You killed the Mountain to avenge your sister, and you ended up toppling the Lannisters entirely. Fate has a twisted sense of humor." Oberyn let out a quiet breath, the weight of everything pressing down upon him. "I only hope that fate will not twist this realm further into ruin." Tyrion offered a faint, bitter laugh. "You sit upon the same throne that drove Aerys mad, that spurred Robert to rebellion, that the Lannisters fought so hard to seize. Beware the swords that surround you. They have a way of drawing blood from the one who dares to sit in them." Oberyn closed his eyes for a moment, recalling the slight prick he felt on his arm upon first sitting. He understood the unspoken warning well enough. Power was a perilous seat, as sharp as any blade, but he had come too far to walk away. This was his chance to reshape the Seven Kingdoms, to deliver a blow against tyranny, and perhaps forge a future where Dorne's independence and dignity would be preserved. He opened his eyes. "You're welcome to remain in the city, Tyrion, or leave if that is your wish. I ask only that you do not conspire against me." Tyrion inclined his head politely. "I doubt I'd succeed if I tried," he admitted with a half-smirk. "And truth be told, I'd rather avoid more chaos. I'll stay for now." Their audience ended. Tyrion departed, leaving Oberyn to contend with the demands of rulership. Messengers arrived from across the realm. Some lords expressed cautious support, recognizing the might behind Oberyn's achievements. Others threatened to muster armies in the name of the rightful King Tommen. Across the narrow sea, the exiled Targaryen queen, Daenerys, continued her own attempts to sail west, though whether she would see Oberyn as an enemy or potential ally remained uncertain. The stage was set for a new political landscape, with Dorne at its center for the first time in centuries. As the weeks wore on, Oberyn and Dorne worked tirelessly to establish a Dornish-led council to govern King's Landing and manage the transition of power. They appointed capable men and women from various regions who had shown loyalty to Dorne's cause. Every day, Oberyn presided over audiences, dispensing judgments, reconciling disputes, and forging alliances. Over time, More and more ravens arrived bearing the seals of noble houses, some swearing fealty, others clinging to neutrality. Resistance still lingered, but with Tywin's capture and Cersei's disgrace, the momentum clearly belonged to House Martell. The city itself slowly began to recover. The starving masses received rations from Dornish stores, though there was never enough to erase the hunger entirely. Dornish soldiers patrolled the streets, enforcing martial law with a firm but not overly cruel hand. The blackened ruins of the King's Gate and other battered fortifications were repaired, often with conscripted labor from Lannister loyalists. The Red Keep's dungeons filled with captured knights and courtiers awaiting trial. During that time, Oberyn ordered a public hearing for Tywin. The old lion, nursing his wounded shoulder, was brought forth in chains. The crowd that gathered in the throne room was large and boisterous, eager to see the man who had ruled them from behind the scenes for so long. Tywin's gaze was cold and proud, even in defeat. Oberyn recounted the crimes laid at Tywin's feet, the murder of Elia Martell and her children, the cruelty inflicted upon the realm, the countless manipulations that had led to bloodshed and oppression. The people in attendance listened in hushed awe, many nodding grimly. Tywin responded with a controlled, scornful rebuke, claiming he had done only what was necessary to ensure stability and protect his family's interests. He refused to acknowledge direct responsibility for Elia's death, continuing the lie that Gregor acted on his own. In the end, Oberyn pronounced Tywin guilty, sentencing him to spend his remaining days in a secure fortress under Dornish custody. Some called for Tywin's head, but Oberyn allowed him to live, a mercy that some saw as a calculated move to appease potential rebels, others as a sign that Oberyn was not the monster he could have been. Tywin remained stoic, the set of his jaw betraying only faint emotion. He accepted his exile, leaving the throne room under heavy guard, destined for a life in a remote dungeon. Cersei's trial came soon after. She was charged with myriad offenses, from conspiracy to murder. Her reaction was more volatile. She railed against the court, cursing Oberyn, spitting on the Dornish guards, and demanding that Tommen's authority be recognized. But Tommen was just a boy, absent and powerless. In the end, Oberyn ordered her confined to a sept to perform public penance for her crimes, after which she would remain under house arrest, stripped of titles and power. It was perhaps a harsher punishment in her eyes than death, forcing her to live in shame. In the aftermath, King's Landing wore a new face. Streets pulsed with wariness, still healing from the siege. Yet a tentative hope glimmered, hope that a ruler from Dorne might challenge the cycle of tyranny. Oberyn presided over the small council, which included representatives from several regions. He sought to reduce the burdensome taxes that had weighed heavily on the small folk, though the demands of rebuilding a war-torn city were immense. The crown's coffers, once controlled by the Lannisters, were precariously low despite the gold Oberyn brought from Dorne. The iron bank of bravos hovered in the background, always ready to exploit a kingdom's vulnerabilities. Still, there were days when Oberyn would stroll through the city incognito, accompanied by only a few loyal guards. He would talk to merchants, smell the spices in the market stalls, sample the local Alesh in taverns. He found that some people regarded him with guarded respect, others with fear. The memory of the siege was fresh, and many wondered if this new regime was truly Kinder or merely another monster wearing a different face. Oberyn did what he could to prove that life under Martell rule would not mirror Lannister oppression. Schools were opened for orphan children, alms distributed to the destitute. He encouraged a semblance of justice, punishing those among his own ranks who committed abuses of power. Yet the realm beyond King's Landing was far from settled. Fresh rebellions brewed in the Westerlands and in pockets of the Stormlands. Sellsword companies roamed at will, and talk of Daenerys Targaryen sailing for Westeros with her dragons reached Oberyn's ears. The ghosts of the old order had not vanished. The line between conqueror and caretaker proved razor-thin, and each day brought new challenges. Late at night, Oberyn would sometimes find himself alone in the throne room, the flicker of torches dancing on the metallic spires of the Iron Throne. He would ascend the steps and stand beside the seat of power, silent, remembering how it all began. The day he bested the mountain in single combat and set into motion the overthrow of King's Landing. He thought of Elia, of the children she would never see grow up, of the vengeance he had pursued so fiercely. The city was his now, and with it the burden of leading an entire realm. He could feel the weight of it pressing on his soul. This was the victory he had coveted, the justice he had declared essential. But was it enough to fill the void left by loss? Sometimes, in those lonely moments, he whispered Elia's name to the empty throne room, as if calling upon her spirit to guide him. Though the hall gave no answer, Oberyn found a certain solace in the ritual. He swore he would not allow the legacy of House Martell to descend into the same violence and cruelty they had sought to overthrow. He would try to rule with a measure of mercy, tempered by justice, and let the realm witness that Dorne's sun rose not only to scorch but also to illuminate. Thus began a new chapter in the history of Westeros, one where the Red Viper of Dorne, having survived his fatal dance with the mountain, took the Iron Throne by force. The realm would bear witness to how Oberyn Martell, driven by fury and shaped by tragedy, would strive to unify or, perhaps, fracture the Seven Kingdoms anew. For better or worse, the lion had fallen, and the sun and spear now cast its shadow over King's Landing. Whether it would usher in an era of renewal or unleash fresh chaos was a question only time could answer. And yet, in the winding streets, in the battered castles, in the hearts of the small folk, a tremor of change coursed through the land, a whispered rumor that the viper's sting had not brought only venom, but the faint, daring promise of hope.